I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest, some great state parks, and ton of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, a lot of people where I live are really poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I can do most of my work online. If I didn't have that going for me, I have to move somewhere else. It's just one of those small towns that will rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay there too long. Excluding a handful of doctors and lawyers and Georgia Power Company employees, the only employment in the area is Walmart, fast food, and a couple of grocery stores. To the east of my town, there's a massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really like hiking on them with my dog, but it can be a bit of an unnerving experience sometimes. It's about a 10-mile drive from town. There's no cell phone service or homes for miles. In the past, there's been a lot of vehicle break-ins at the trailhead. The gravel parking lots at some of them glitter with bits of broken glass from what I'm guessing were car windows. Sometimes there are really shifty people hanging out about these trailheads, or just driving around on Forest Service roads. These are really rough roads, and you'll see these beat-up $500 cars just barreling down them, meant for 4x4. Some of the people you see in these cars look like the guy that got crushed by an ATM in Breaking Bad. All that being said, it's still a great place to camp. However, you just have to be careful. A few years ago, two of my friends and I decided to go play paintball in that national forest. We decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip so we could play the next morning too. After a pretty eventful day of shooting paintballs at one another, we drove a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, a church group or something had taken up all the spots in that area. That was really the only camping spot we were familiar with, and it was getting pretty late, so we decided to keep looking. We drove for about another hour further and further into the woods. By this time, it's getting dark, and we're getting a bit worried about finding a spot to camp. We all had GPS on our phones, but none of us had any service. We turn off into an unfamiliar road that isn't in very good shape. In fact, it looks like the Forest Service rangers used a backhoe to block off the road with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. That being said, it looked like some off-road vehicles had been going over the mound, so it was pretty worn down. Our F-150 had pretty high clearance, so we decided to go over it as well. There's an old gravel road on the other side, and this road was pretty much clear of any debris. We drove a few miles down the road and came across an opening next to a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over a plywood table nailed to a tree, which seemed kind of odd. That said, it was pretty much dark at this point, and we didn't want to keep driving around all night looking for a camping spot. We left the truck light running and set up our tent. After we got done, I started to notice there was a lot of trash in the woods surrounding the area. I could see a green bottle lying in the ground and took a look at the label, only to find out that it was a bottle of Home and Garden insecticide. I was really tired at the time and just thought that someone had been dumping their home garbage out there. None of us thought it was weird that someone would be dumping garbage in an area that is more than an hour from the nearest home. We set up camp, had some beers, and made chili from scratch. By this time, it was probably around 11 p.m. As we're eating, we notice a faint glow from the other side of a hill nearby. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles didn't make sense. It didn't seem to be a bright light, and it wasn't moving. It was like a glow that you'd see over a bright city, and we couldn't see the light source itself. Since there were no other access roads in the area, we decided it wasn't other campers. The hill was about a quarter of a mile from our campsite, so we decided to go investigate. Under normal circumstances, I know I wouldn't have done so. However, we'd all had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, and two of us, Jacob and I, decided to take a look. My other friend Isaac decided he wanted to stay behind to pop some popcorn over the fire. We began walking toward that light source. The situation got even stranger. All the trees in the area have their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. We thought it could have been the work of a beaver that lived in the creek, but it just seemed strange that a beaver would go around to all these trees and just knock off the bark in a circle. Jacob and I start talking about the ghost beaver in pretty loud voices, probably due to our drunkenness. As we're almost to the top of the hill, Jacob tripped and yelled, "Oh shit!" After a few seconds he yelled, the light, whatever it was, went out. We look at one another, decide that maybe we don't need to see what that light is after all. We walk back in silence, keep looking back over our shoulders every few seconds. We decided to turn our flashlight off and just use the moonlight to get back to our campsite. We get back a couple of 100 feet from the campsite and see my other friend Isaac walking around the campsite. He was wearing a hooded coat that I hadn't seen him wearing before, and for some reason, he's carrying his paintball gun around in his hand. That seemed a little odd, we said to each other. The fire had started to die down, and we couldn't see our campsite very well anymore. At this point, we'd probably been gone for almost an hour. From the distance, it looked like Isaac was looking for something. He kept walking around the site, was peering in the tent. When we were almost back to our campsite, we saw Isaac walk up the road we'd come in on. We figured that he was going to use the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us. When we got back, we sat next to the fire and waited for Isaac to come back. All of a sudden, we see him lurch out of the tent. He stumbles a few feet and vomits. After we left, he'd had a few more rum and cokes, he mumbled. We asked him why he kept wandering around the campsite with a paintball gun, and he gets a strange look on his face. "They're locked up in the cab of the truck. Did you unlock it?" We go and check the truck, enter the door code, and see all our paintball equipment just as we left it before. The keys to the truck were still hidden in the magnetic fob underneath, and I get a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. "Isaac, what were you doing after we left?" I asked. Watching a movie on my phone, then I fell asleep, I guess." "But you were walking around with your paintball gun, right? Did you just change jackets?" Isaac said he'd been in the tent since we left, and that he'd been wearing the same unhooded fleece all night. Someone had been walking around our campsite, and it wasn't Isaac. At this point, all of us are way too drunk to drive, but we decide to go ahead and pack up and go back to my house for the night. We don't bother packing up the tent. We just fold it down with the sleeping bags and everything in it. We jump back in the F-150 and I start to drive out. When we get to that dirt hump, we see something gray blocking our path. The metal barrier that had been laying in the woods earlier is now back on its stand, right on top of the hump from earlier. By this point, all of us have sobered up to the situation. No one wants to get out of the car to try to move the barrier. I had the metal guard on the front of my truck, so I drive forward slowly, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck, and it falls right off. And we drive over it very slowly. We were all terrified that it would pop one of the truck's tires as we drove over it, but thankfully, it didn't. As we drove down the road, we see another vehicle following us with its lights off. It's probably 1,000 feet behind us, and we keep catching glimpses of it as the moon reflects light off of it. I start to drive as fast as I can down that Forest Service road, and that same vehicle kept pace. It never got any closer though. It just stayed 1 or 2 car lengths behind, and we can only see it when the road straightens out. After about 45 minutes of speeding along gravel roads, we make it to the main paved road, and I start to drive everyone back to my house, but I decided to go a different way just to be safe. I didn't want to get pulled over for a DUI. Camping can be fun, but very rural camping can be dangerous. I've driven past that metal barrier since that time, but it's always been in place, and I will never go back down that road ever again. My dad and I would occasionally go hunting together when I was a kid. I was 14, and my dad knew a guy who owned what seemed to be half of Georgia. I mean, the amount of property this guy owned was ridiculous. He let people hunt there if he trusted you. And if he liked you, he'd let you camp out there for a couple of nights if you wanted. He always made sure we had a way to call for help though, before we did it. I loved camping out there more than I did just going hunting for a few hours, then coming home. I liked the woodsman feel of living out in the woods. We woke up early one morning and I hiked into the woods. It was still dark when we got to our stand. We didn't see or hear anything, not even birds. I remember my dad commenting on it, and looking back, it should have been a sign. Frustrated, we pack up and look for a spot to camp, and we would set up again later that evening. My dad suggested that we go deeper in to better our chances of seeing something, so that's exactly what we did. We hiked for a few hours, found a clearing, and set up a small camp. Got settled and passed the time freaking ourselves out by talking about Bigfoot and other woodland creatures. We hike a ways away from camp, set up our blind, and wait. Again, nothing. We get back and our tent has been pulled up and laid flat. Not in a neat way, but it's just kind of laying there. We thought it was just a wind or something. We didn't put it upright, and then maybe it collapsed. So in the moment, we really didn't think much of it. Since we didn't see or even hear anything all day, we decided to leave the following day and try again later that week. We settle in for the night, build a really small fire, and just relax. Again, not even birds are making a sound. I remember thinking how odd it was to be this deep into the woods and only hear one or two birds the whole trip. Oh well, maybe we are making too much noise and scared everything off. We go to sleep soon after settling in. It's pitch black, middle of the night. I wake up for some reason just to try to go back to sleep. I'm in that half awake, half asleep phase when I hear laughter. I kind of jolt awake, but don't hear it anymore, so I figured I was dreaming. I lay back down. A few minutes later, I hear it again. It continues and gets pretty loud this time. I wake up now, and this time my dad is up too. And he whispers and asks, "Did you hear that?" And this is when my heart dropped. I heard the laughing too. It wasn't a dream. We both heard it again, but it was faint. And now that I'm actually awake, I'm paying attention to it. It sounded like several people laughing in unison. It wasn't cackling or hysterical laughter, but just kind of normal laughter. It didn't last but for maybe 5 or 6 seconds long. And I've never felt that much fear before in my entire life. We didn't hear anymore after that. But needless to say, we didn't get much sleep. As soon as the sun came up, you bet your ass we got out of there. My dad was convinced someone followed us and was just playing some kind of prank. And that's why we didn't see anything. He said, while we were in the stand and blind, they were scaring off all the wildlife with their unmasked scent and being on the ground. He says this, but he didn't go back out there for over a month. When he finally did go back, he mentioned it to the guy who owned the property. He wouldn't let my dad hunt there anymore. Didn't tell him why either. My dad thinks he made the guy think my dad was actually crazy or something. I guess it's possible for someone to have followed us out there. It must have been legit ninjas though, because we went out before daybreak. Nobody but the owner was parked out there that morning. There were dead leaves and sticks everywhere. And when they decided to laugh, it came from different spots. And I never heard one footstep. Sorry if this wasn't really what you're looking for. It's one of my best stories. Even if nobody I tell believes me, I still get goosebumps. I was in my last year before retiring from the Army and was going through a divorce. My soon-to-be ex went back to Texas with my 2 girls, and I planned to move closer to them once my retirement was official. I rented a small 2-bedroom in Tennessee in a town called Indian Mound. Indian Mound was out of the way and really isolated. My commute sucked, but it was cheap and peaceful. I had no neighbors. Across the street was a conservation land for miles. On one side, and around the back of the property was a swamp. On the other side, the closest house was out of shouting distance. I enjoyed living there initially. Before this, I'd lived in the suburbs. All the noise, people, and traffic drove me absolutely crazy. One night, I came home around 1 in the morning from a concert in Nashville. It was early spring. It was somewhat foggy. The driveway dipped down, and the house was about an eighth mile away from the road. As I pulled in, I saw a huge black dog standing in the front yard. It stood with its head up and its tail straight up as well, fixed on me. I slowly pulled my car up, unsure of what to do next, when it turned and ran into the swamp. Didn't really think much of it and went back inside. Over the following few months, things began happening at night. I'd always wake up around 3 or so in the morning, thinking I heard voices outside my window. And sometimes, it sounded like people or a couple of people were whispering to each other, but I couldn't quite understand what they were saying. And sometimes, I would also hear footsteps and movement outside. I thought it was maybe a deer or that dog I saw, but when I looked out, I would see nothing. This type of shit continued on for months and months. Another night, I woke up to a noise and saw that it was 2:57 a.m. A bright white light shone through the porch glass doors. I ran into the kitchen and looked through a small sink window, and it looked like someone was out in the swamp shining a spotlight. It was one of those high-powered lights used in search and rescue. It was blinding and lit up the whole kitchen. As I opened up the back door and ran out into the porch, yelling I was going to call the cops, the light suddenly went out. I heard someone moving away from the house and back into the swamp. Cops came out and took a report, told me to ensure that my doors were locked and to call if anything else happened. I was hyper-vigilant for the next few days. I checked behind me when I was coming and going. I slept with the shades drawn and doors locked. The footsteps around the house continued, and some nights, I thought I could hear a dog panting outside my window. Although, I never found tracks or saw signs of an animal in the morning. Things did die down for a while, and I was about 3 months away from the end of my lease. I woke up about 3 in the morning, scared out of my mind. I was sleeping and I heard a woman calling my name in a dream. I opened my eyes and realized that it was a dream. But then I heard my voice get called out again, clear as day. I shot up, got out of bed, and turned on the lights. I checked in the closet under the bed. I opened up my bedroom door and listened out into the hallway. Couldn't hear anything now. I was about to cut the lights and go back to bed when something pounded on my front door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was like someone was bashing the door with a sledgehammer. I yelled out that I had a gun and get the fuck off my property. I said I called the cops, and I'll blow your fucking head off before they get here. The pounding stopped. Cops came out again and took another report. There was no damage to the door or any footprints around my property. It all just stopped after that, and I did buy a 9mm, but the rest of my time renting there went without incident. I'm now back in Texas, in an apartment complex in the burbs, and I don't mind. The backwoods of Tennessee were a very creepy place. Several years ago, my friends Sean, Melanie, and I got really interested in geocaching. They had a new GPS unit that they just had to try out, what with all its fancy features and light-up buttons. We did a few local ones to get the hang of it, then decided we could totally handle the expert-rated tough ones. This led us to northeastern Connecticut, called the Quiet Corner. There isn't much out there in way of civilization, just a lot of wooded roads with houses spaced widely apart and hidden in the trees. It was an overcast and misty day, which added to the isolation we felt from the world. We arrived at the first cache, which was in the middle of a one-way bridge. The bridge connected 2 causeways in the middle of a wooded pond and had steel guardrails. The cache was attached to the rail by a magnet, dangling it out over the water. It took us around 20 minutes to find it, and during that time, a car driven by a disheveled older man drove by 3 times. The first time we noticed him because he looked unkempt. The second time, we figured he was lost. The third, because we got chills down our spine. We had just found the cash, and our thoughts changed from, hooray, we win, to, let's get the hell out of here. Unfortunately for us, this was what was known as a multi-cache. You had to find the first one, then it gives you coordinates to the next and so on. The next cache was a few miles away, and we were more than happy to leave our current location. We arrived at the second location, miles through the woods, near the Rhode Island border. We were very close to a state park, and being on the border meant even less civilization. We got out of the car and searched the short way down the abandoned rail line to find the cache. While we were in the trees, we heard only a single car go by and headed deeper into the woods toward the border. The cache was easy. As we got back to our car, a vehicle approached, coming from the direction of the border, and began to slow down. It was him, miles from where we'd been last. He'd obviously been the car that we'd heard drive by a few minutes earlier as well. It was at this point that serious concern set in. Who is this guy, and what does he want with us? Thankfully, there were a few houses around, so he drove off. We assumed whatever he was planning, that he wasn't going to do it in front of witnesses. We decided to plug in the next set of coordinates and take a very roundabout route at high speeds with the hope of losing him. Sean is a bit of a maniac driver anyway, so you can imagine the whiteness of our knuckles as he kicked it up a notch. I swear, if I ever get stupid and find myself needing a getaway driver, I'm calling him. After a while, we all figured we'd lost him, and we get to our next destination. It's another section of the rail trail, miles from the first two locations. No one behind us. No signs of anything remotely human except our own car. We're in the deep woods on a road that started as pavement and has now turned to dirt. Just us and the trees and the fog, which had settled in harder on the drive over. We get out, and I feel as though we're finally safe. We begin to walk into the woods and get maybe 100 feet into the trail when we hear the sound of tires on gravel. Quickly, we darted off to the side of the trail and hide in the bushes. It's him. It seemed to take an eternity for his car to drive by as he slowly inspected our vehicle. Finally, he drove away, down and around a bend in the road. And we could see several hundred feet down the road where he disappeared to, so we knew we only had a short amount of time to get out of there. We jumped out of the bushes and ran for the car. We leapt in and tore off up the road in the opposite direction. Fortunately, my brother-in-law's parents' house was very close by, and we knew that they were away on a cruise for a week, so we could not seek help there. However, familiar territory does make one feel safer, so we pulled into their deep, long driveway and then hid the car behind some shrubberies. Before I go on, there is a great deal to mention about Sean. He is a huge dude, like 6'3". On top of that, his hair and beard look familiar to Hagrid from Harry Potter. He wears trench coats everywhere and is very much a fan of H.P. Lovecraft. He likes to read passages from the Necronomicon for random fun. He can be a very intimidating character to the uninitiated. Thus, it should come as no surprise to you that the trunk of his car was full of things, such as a baseball bat, several cleavers, a screwdriver that he'd ground down and fashioned into an embalming hook, as well as various and sundry hatchets, all cast iron, all rusty. His car at the time was like a one-man traveling horror show. Once we'd hidden the car, we all grabbed various weaponry out of the trunk to arm ourselves with, and waited. 5 minutes later, our homeless-esque stalker had returned. He drove by 3 more times in the next 10 minutes. After waiting what felt like an eternity, but was really only a half an hour, we finally decided that he was probably not going to return. We did finish the geocache, which actually had a few cool prizes in it, but we never saw our stalker again, which was probably the best for him. Sean is very protective of Melanie. We probably would have gutted him on the spot. Still, the creepiest experience of my life. I'm a summer camp counselor. I work every summer for a camp for 5 weeks. One time, we were backpacking to the tallest peak in my state. At night, me and a coworker/friend went on a night hike to get away from the kids. We laid down on a slope in a patch of grass to stargaze, about a quarter mile from everyone else. As we were laying, I heard the most beautiful sound of water behind me, and I mean beautiful. I've never heard water running before, and I thought to myself, wow, this sounds beautiful. All I could imagine was crisp, clear water gracefully trickling by. I had this image stuck in my head. I had this sudden urge to go find it as well. Not even just an urge, but a need to find that creek. Now behind us was a dense forest and brush, so it would have been hard to find it at night, but it sounded like it was somewhere close to us. Me and my friend looked at each other without saying a word, and I knew he was having the exact same thought as me. I said to myself, let's wait 5 minutes, then we'll decide if we should check it out or not. It felt like a playful presence was trying to persuade us to go over there. Then I decided that we should go check it out, so we stood up without saying anything to each other. It just sort of happened. As we were approaching the sound, it became quieter and quieter. We stopped, not knowing if we wanted to continue. As we stood there, the noise of trickling water became louder and louder until it sounded like we were standing next to a river. That's when I said, let's come back tomorrow and find it. We agreed to come back later. When I made that decision, the sound of the creek vanished along with the urge to go. There was only silence. The presence that I'd felt earlier suddenly became sinister. It was just this dark feeling of a presence, kind of similar to knowing when someone is watching you. Then I felt this fear slowly creeping up from my belly. We walked back to camp quickly without speaking to one another. And once we got back, we started talking about what had just happened. My friend had the exact same urge to find the creek and the same internal struggle fighting that urge to go and look for it. When we got back, it was like a trance had been lifted, and only then did we realize that what happened was not normal. We both could think clear now, like a fog had been lifted. That urge I felt did not feel like my own mind's urge. It's hard to explain, like an urge placed there because once the sound of water stopped, the urge stopped. The next morning, we went back to that spot and went to the place where we heard that creek. We looked and looked, but could not find any sort of creek or water. We later checked some maps of where we were and found more proof that there's no creeks or water even nearby. I'm scared to imagine what would have happened if we followed the sound of that water because of the ominous presence we both felt. If I was by myself, I would have thought I was imagining it, but my friend thought, felt, and experienced the same thing I did. I don't know what it was, but it was eerie to say the least. What's strange is neither of us said anything to one another once we heard that sound of water, and yet we both made the decision to go look for it without even speaking to each other. We both felt that sinister presence trying to lure us in, and I'm thankful we decided to go back the next day and didn't give in to the urge in that moment. I'll preface this by saying we were 12 and 13 at the time, and my friend and I often snuck out of either of our houses during sleepovers for late night walks. This was the basis of this terrifying encounter, and it stopped us from ever sneaking out into the dark ever again. My friend lived opposite of a huge forest, so her house was the preferred choice to sneak out. We always took flashlights, food, blankets, so we could quote-unquote camp out for a couple of hours before going back home again. On this fateful night, we inadvertently fell asleep instead of staying awake, so when my friend suddenly jolted me from sleep, it was past 3 a.m. It was a lot later than we normally snuck out. We grabbed our essentials and creeped out the back door into the cold and dark night. Frost crunched underneath our feet as we crossed the deserted road and reached the entrance to the forest. We began noticing how pitch black it was and how completely silent it was as well. Unnervingly so. We turned on our torches and stepped onto the uneven path into the forest, the light illuminating the trees swaying in the icy wind. We stepped onto fallen sodden leaves and bark as we made an unsteady but familiar way into our favorite part of that forest. A cold breath, the only noise to invade the deafening silence. We reached the small hut that we'd constructed one afternoon, made entirely of sticks, purely for the purpose of having some shelter for our campouts. There were times that vandals or other kids damaged our hut, but for the most part, it stayed intact. But on this occasion, it was completely destroyed. We were just deciding to call it a night and maybe come back later on that day to repair the hut when we heard it. This loud, shrieking giggle that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My friend and I jumped in shock and looked at one another like, what was that? We were completely freaked out. The eerie and unnatural giggle rang out again, contradicting the silence and making my body break out in goosebumps. Someone is in here, my friend whispered to me, looking utterly terrified. We have to go now. Her voice of rationale made it even more scary and unnerving to me that someone was in the forest with us at 3 o'clock in the morning. We just looked at one another and took off running in unison, our footsteps navigating the path as naturally as we could from muscle memory, our uneven gasp of air punctuating the giggling that seemed to be following us, getting closer and closer. Our torches went up and down with our fast movements, illuminating random patches of trees and bushes as we finally saw a small sliver of light as we came back to the forest entrance. Running out of the forest, we didn't stop until we reached the back door of my friend's house and almost collapsed in a breathless heap of relief to be safe. Then my friend's eyes went wide and she nudged me, pointing a shaking finger across the yard. A haggard woman of undeterminable age was standing at the forest entrance giggling with that awful, horrifying giggle and was waving us back over. We screamed and ran inside and looked out of my friend's bedroom window through the smallest gap in the curtain. We could still see the woman standing there. Worse yet, she was staring right back at us as if she knew that we were looking at her. You could tell that she was still giggling, a hideous, appalling laugh. She turned very slowly and walked back into the forest again. We never went back out to that forest, nor went out after dark ever again. Hey everybody, thanks for listening if you stuck around to this point. If you haven't yet, please hit that like button, slap that like button. Hit the subscribe button and that notification bell to be notified when future episodes come out. If you, yes you, have a true scary story of your own, feel free to send it to my email or post it to my subreddit. You can stalk me on Twitter, you can stalk me on Facebook, and you can also stalk me on Instagram. Oh, and please go check out my new channel, Horrid, if you like true crime, tragedy, and the occult. That link will be in the description as well. Thank you so much for listening and for all the support. I know this episode was originally meant to be just a straight up like true scary stories or whatever with all kinds of themes and stuff jumbled up, but then I went back to all the stories that I'd gotten permission for, as well as finding a couple more, and they all kind of fit the wilderness, deep woods vibe, and I really like these stories, and I really like deep woods stories when, you know, you find good ones, and there's a couple in here that I really enjoyed, so I hope you do too. Outside of that, I have no idea what the hell I'm going to do theme-wise next week. As always, put some kind of, what is it called? Oh my god. Recommendation, there's something you'd like to hear down in the comments below. I know you guys do occasionally, but sometimes I miss it, so please keep doing that. Just be repetitive and be like, "Nay, you have never done this, please do more of this," or "Hey, do this, stupid. Hey, dum-dum." Yeah, sometimes I'm a man-child and I get distracted very easily, so it doesn't take much, and sometimes you just gotta take me and pull me back over to the road and on the straight and narrow because I'll get distracted. So yeah. Outside of that, I don't know. I don't think I really have anything. I think I'm going to go grab some beers after this. It's for tonight to have a couple drinky poos because that sounds pretty good. And get ready for the remake of Resident Evil 4 tomorrow. I am so fucking stoked and so excited to play that game. Best Resident Evil game out there. Don't care. Fight me. Whatever. Yeah. Anyway. That's it, guys. I will see you next week for whatever I decide or whatever kind of stories I can find. If I can't find anything theme-wise, I'll just do another True Scary Stories next week. All right, guys. Have a good weekend. I'll see you then. Cheers.